Employment Law After Hours is back with some more breaking news for you. We just received information that OSHA has issued another surprising decision for healthcare employers. This decision follows the Supreme Court's decision just last week forbidding OSHA from enforcing its ETS nationwide. The consequences of OSHA's recent announcement will be widespread throughout the healthcare industry, so this is definitely going to be important information to get out there. Before we get to this important announcement, I do want to differentiate what we are talking about here. Up until last week, there was essentially three major areas of regulations that were controlling the healthcare industry. First, you had the CMS vaccine mandate. We just released an episode on that yesterday, so you'll want to take a look at that because that CMS vaccine mandate does apply to healthcare providers. The second set of regulations that applies to healthcare providers concerns the standard OSHA ETS that was ruled against last week by the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll post another link to that in the descriptions for more information on that decision. But that was the decision that regarded mandatory testing and mask wearing for unvaccinated employees. There's a third set of regulations that has not gotten a lot of coverage because it was already implemented over the summer without much publicity, otherwise controversy. That is called the OSHA Healthcare ETS. It's separate from the OSHA Emergency Temporary Standard that the Supreme Court decided last week. That OSHA Healthcare ETS, which we previously covered last summer, we'll post a link to that description below, contained a lot of requirements for healthcare providers that they had to implement in order to stay compliant with OSHA's safety standards to prevent patients and staff from getting COVID-19. Some of those requirements concerned changes to ventilation systems, mandatory masking for not only vaccinated but unvaccinated employees, as well as checks to visitors and patients coming into a healthcare facility. They were very cumbersome, very widespread over the entire healthcare process. They required a lot of work to implement these safety standards. This healthcare ETS is what is the subject of this episode. We just received notification that OSHA has decided to stop enforcement of that healthcare ETS as of January 1st, 2022. Essentially, OSHA considers the healthcare ETS to no longer be in effect. The reason for that is rooted in basically a legal standard that requires OSHA to follow up on an ETS within 6 months with a formal rule. OSHA has indicated that it's unable to get that final rule done within that 6 months, so they have to forego the enforcement. Although OSHA states that they will have a formal final rule to replace that ETS in the very near future, we do not yet have that. So as of right now, there's no healthcare ETS in place for healthcare providers. However, there's two quick caveats to this. First, OSHA states that the decision to forego the enforcement of the healthcare ETS does not apply to the record-keeping requirements that are contained within that healthcare ETS. Essentially, as part of that prior ETS that came out last summer, healthcare providers are required to document every employee that gets COVID, regardless of whether that employee got COVID at work, was suspected of getting COVID at work, and regardless of whether they had symptoms. Those healthcare employers had to document all COVID cases among their employees. So OSHA wants us to know that it still intends on enforcing those record-keeping requirements for those healthcare employers, as the passing of those requirements fell under a separate standard, therefore they can still enforce them. Second, OSHA said that although the ETS for healthcare employers is no longer in effect, it still intends to hold employers to many of those standards, specifically social distancing, symptom checking, and mask wearing, under their general duty to prevent workplace harm. That's a pretty significant decision coming from OSHA. Essentially, what they're saying is, although this ETS is not in effect, they are still going to make the decision that they can try to enforce and potentially penalize employers if they are not taking those steps under that ETS to keep their workplace safe. Namely, OSHA wants employers to focus on the PPE and respiratory safety programs that are contained under the ETS. It further goes on to state that it will consider employers to be compliant with their general duty obligations under OSHA if they implement all the safeguards under the healthcare ETS. So what does this mean for healthcare employers? Essentially, although the healthcare ETS is no longer in effect pending final implementation of a rule sometime in the future, which may or may not come, those healthcare employers should continue to follow all PPE, social distancing, mask wearing, respiratory programs, among the other safety standards that they've implemented since last summer to keep their employees safe. We don't want healthcare employers finding themselves in a position where they're having an outbreak at work worse than what's already going on, and then OSHA's coming in to conduct an investigation and possibly levy fines. You may be saying to yourself, well, how is OSHA going to find out there's widespread COVID across the country? We've previously touched on this issue before, but OSHA primarily will rely on whistleblower employees who come forward, call OSHA, notify them, and say, hey, my healthcare employer is not following these standards, it's leading to these outbreaks at work, etc. We don't want that situation where OSHA is knocking on the door demanding to do an investigation. Therefore, healthcare employers, although this ETS is no longer in effect, you should continue to abide by those safety requirements and recommendations that we implemented last summer under the ETS, as stated by OSHA. This will put many employers in the best case scenario to avoid those OSHA investigations and fines. We really appreciate you sticking with us as we bring this breaking news to you. Don't forget to subscribe so you are instantly notified when we release these new episodes. They seem to be coming every other day now at this point. But we really appreciate you staying tuned to Employment Law After Hours, and we look forward to seeing you next time.